Okay, round two. Round two of this, thing that this will be our secret to the two people that watch this. And, as opposed to the other people that are on YouTube doing these things, don't share. Unsubscribe. Just kidding. Please subscribe. Do you. I don't really care. But yeah, anyway, so today, I just want to, I want to pick up on what I was talking about yesterday, or whatever. It wasn't yesterday that I recorded the first video, whenever it was. And I want to talk about sleeping machines today. I'll talk about Insomniac Fiends again too, but also just kind of elaborate on some of the stuff I was saying. Okay, what's going on here? Got to get comfortable. I feel like, is that better? Probably better to obscure my face. But yeah, so I want to talk about basically. Okay, so one thing I was talking about last video was this idea of memory being sort of very important for consciousness. And I think kind of fundamental because, as I explained in the last video, consciousness, by my definition, and I think basically everybody's definition that thinks about it, is self-concept. It's, awareness of oneself. And in order to do that, you have to have a way to build a projection of yourself. And you can't do that if you're only living in the present, which is, as I explained, why consciousness sort of inherently has this property of time. And time brings the necessity of memory, because you need to bank things to project into the future and the past. And by bank, I mean, you need places to store the projections. And so to store a projection and is this making sense? So the point is that, you need space to store the memory that is yourself. And that's why sort of consciousness and memory and time, all of these things are fundamental. And a sleeping machine is not going to basically have a concept of oneself. And sort of the outgrowth of this is that you won't be empathic. A sleeping machine isn't empathic or empathetic, however you want to say it. And I think this is sort of important for what I want to talk about today, because, I think I explained, if you sort of reside, I think basically we all have the capacity to reside on either extreme of consciousness throughout our life, whether it's in the insomniac fiend sort of hyper-aware state or in the sleeping machine. I got to get the hand. Yeah. Anyway, or in the sleeping machine sort of non-aware state. Empathy is sort of goes hand in hand with self-concept, because it's this idea of, if you, what is empathy? It's putting yourself in other people's shoes, and to do that, you need, again, going back to this memory idea, you need a place to store this projection of another person, where you are, thinking about, okay, well, so if I were in that scenario, how would I feel? And all of that takes you out of the present into the amorphous not present that I sort of explained, that can be further broken into a past in the future. And yeah, so I think that's important to sort of, for me, at least, maybe not for you guys, but if you're listening to this, it might be important to you, because you've at least felt that it's worth your time to listen to me talk about this. This is why I find basically the sort of pathologic, what's the word? I don't know, state of the sleeping machine is barbarism. And that's because a barbaric person is not an empathetic person. They're not thinking about you. They're just thinking about, whatever. They're thinking about the basal sort of functions that need to be, they're just reacting essentially to their physiology at that moment. And that physiology might be an aggressive one. It's the reptilian brain idea. And so this is sort of beginning to discuss some of the things that I'll be talking about more in videos. But my objective here is to kind of talk about all this from a neuroanatomy standpoint, and slowly get a little bit less abstract, because I think ultimately what I'm trying to do is I'm doing what a lot of people are trying to do, is understand consciousness. And I just personally feel like the only way to do that is to understand the hardware, and the hardware is the neuroanatomy. And so, so to talk more about this, I'll talk a little bit about the neuroanatomy. So you have the central nervous system, which is essentially the brain and the spinal cord. And as you go up into the spinal cord, you sort of progress into more and more, I don't want to say complex. It's hard. You got to be politically correct with this stuff. None of this stuff is value judgments on the other animals, right? But it's just observations of what makes humans different from other animals, is that we have a larger frontal cortex, or prefrontal cortex rather, which is the first part. So I guess maybe the place to start is that, so I've just explained you've got basically the brain, and then you've got the spinal cord. And the spinal cord has different sections, starting with the medulla, so infraspinal regions. And then once you get past the C1 vertebrae, you're into the medulla, and then the pons, and then the midbrain, and then the cortex. The basal ganglia, and then the cortex. And so what you're sort of doing as you progressively move up, is you're sort of slowly becoming more human, if you want to think about it evolutionarily. So we humans have all of these sort of components I just explained, but specifically our prefrontal cortex and just the cortex generally, I believe, is larger than like our most recent ancestors, the chimps. And so this is kind of why we put a lot of our theories about consciousness and whatnot in sort of the cortical regions, because there's just a lot of evidence to support that these are the regions that are supplying the ability to sort of store, our self-concept. And so, like, for instance, I'll talk about the claustrum at a later video. This is something I've been reading more about. The claustrum is the most highly interconnected portion of the brain, and it's just an interesting region because, as I explained sort of in the last video, the most prevailing idea for consciousness, or I guess the mind and sort of how the brain functions, is through the interconnections of neurons. And sort of I believe that consciousness is just coming out of a hyper connected, like a super connected brain. That's sort of what allows consciousness to form, is you just have all these just a tremendous amount of neurons connected together, and then it forms this strange singularity that we call consciousness. And so that's why the claustrum is particularly interesting, because it's the most highly connected region of the brain. Pretty sure it's the most highly connected. I was just reading about this. Also, just, interesting sort of side note, like, for instance, it's got, I think, the most, it's got the highest density of a particular serotonin receptor. I think it's serotonin 2A. But again, I'll have all this sort of figured out more definedly when I talk about it in detail. And this is the receptor that psychedelics such as like psilocybin and LSD bind. And so there's a sort of another reason it seems to be interesting, because obviously from accounts of people that have taken those drugs, it has a very sort of reality shifting effect. So anyway, so what I'm trying to say with all this is that you have a lot of different regions of the brain that are sort of important, but we generally think of the cortex as being the sort of active part while we're awake that is doing a lot of the functions of consciousness and attention. You could say specifically. I mean, there are parts. This is where the brain is complicated because there are parts within the lower regions that are important for attention, but specifically like executive control is sort of where we would put like the prefrontal cortex as very important for that. And so when you're asleep, you have sort of this shift in activity between the cortical regions and the infracortical regions in like the brainstem. The reticular activating system in the pons, for instance, it seems to be important for triggering different states of awake versus REM versus non-REM. And so I bring all of this up because as I've been thinking about this sleeping machine idea, I've been thinking sort of where my mind is going is if you want to understand consciousness, you need to understand the parts of consciousness that are, or you need to a good way to study it is by looking at times when you're not conscious. And so that would be sleep and under anesthesia. And, a case could be made for patients with dementia. It seems, really progressive states of like frontotemporal dementia, Pick's disease, or, Alzheimer's. If you've ever talked to a patient, they're sort of slowly losing their concept of themselves, which is very, that's one of the sort of things that makes those disorders so debilitating and sad to watch from the outside. And all of these have, all of these affect the cortex, and specifically the frontal cortex, and in the case of frontotemporal dementia, the temporal lobe. So yeah, and I'll talk about probably the lobes at another time because that's a way, there's a lot to be said about that. But very briefly, you have 4 lobes: the frontal, the occipital, the temporal, and the parietal. And yeah, but I'll table that because I'm talking about sleeping machines right now, and so yeah, the reason I specifically wanted to do a video on the sleeping machines is to sort of emphasize this idea of, I think I said, I look at consciousness as a spectrum that sort of we all sort of fluctuate between. This is nice. This is fluctuation right here. That we fluctuate throughout our life and throughout the day, and I think certain drugs induce these states too, obviously. As I've already sort of mentioned, the effects of psychedelics on the brain. And specifically, I feel I have a hypothesis that alcohol actually it pushes you towards that sleeping machine state. And so, like, if you've ever been, in your college days or whatever, with friends who black out, and they're not really there, but they are there. I've never blacked out before. I guess I'm lucky because I feel like alcohol has more of, I'll more quickly fall asleep. And so that's sort of the other point, is it has a depressive, it's a depressive. And the reason for this is it's acting on these receptors called GABA receptors, I think specifically GABA A receptors. Other drugs that do this are like benzodiazepines and barbiturates. And this is where I think it becomes interesting because, so a good example of drugs like this that act on these GABA receptors are Ambien, because I think you have a lot of sort of stories about, just anecdotal stories of, on the internet of people talking about taking Ambien, and sort of doing things and then not remembering that they did things, whether they, got up during the night and whatever. I think Roseanne said she was on Ambien when she was making all those tweets. And so that sort of gets at the point that I'm making is that the sleeping machine state, this is an example of Roseanne in that case. She was not conscious, right? But she was still functioning as just a sleeping machine. And you probably could have talked to her during that time, and she could have responded in a reflexive way to what you were saying, just as somebody that's blacked out and is drunk, but they don't have any memory of it. So there's sort of the point, getting back at that point of memory being important for consciousness. And they probably seem a little bit more animalistic in that, they're going to be acting on very sort of basic levels. They might be more prone to anger or frustration and whatnot. And then, there's this discussion of like, are you an angry drunk or are you a happy drunk? And that being reflective of your sort of, some people say it's reflective of your personality. I think it's more of just how you're feeling at that moment. Maybe not your personality, but like if you have a bunch of pent up anger that you're not letting out, and then you get drunk and it's going to come out because you don't have as much executive control. And so I'll have a video on this all because this specific thing, but it's important to talk about for this case, but GABA versus glutamate. So glutamate is the most predominant neurotransmitter in the cortex, and sort of generally, well, it's not it is an activating neurotransmitter, meaning that if a neuron releases glutamate into a synapse onto another neuron, it's going to push that receiving neuron to depolarize and send a electrical cascade to, wherever it's going. And like I said in the previous video, that's sort of how we think about neurons as communicating, is through these electrical oscillations. So that's why it's an activating neurotransmitter, whereas GABA is going to hyperpolarize cells and reduce the propensity to activate. And does this through a variety of mechanisms, chloride being sort of the most simple, whereas activation is through, sodium influx, potassium outflux. Anyway, we could get into a whole thing about that. And then calcium is very important through this all. And so, okay. So the reason I bring that up is because, again, as I said, so you've got these drugs like alcohol and barbiturates and benzodiazepines that are working on these GABA receptors to basically cause inhibition wherever there are neurons that are going to be inhibiting. And so generally there's this pattern in the brain. Again, generally there's always exceptions, but it's that you have a neuron, and then you have an inner neuron, and then you have another neuron. And the inner neuron is generally going to be a GABAergic neuron. So it's an inhibitory neuron. And this is kind of how the brain functions, is that you have these sort of very complicated circuits where you'll have a glutamatergic neuron that synapses on an inner neuron that's GABAergic. And so activating the inhibitory neurons going to actually inhibit the downstream, the third neuron in the sequence, because activating inhibitory neuron is going to inhibit. So anyway, yeah, that's one of the most sort of complicated things about neuroanatomy. If you ever study it, is especially like the basal ganglia, because you have these circuits of just like activation and inhibition that result in, either inhibition of movement or activation of movement. Basal ganglia is very important for that, which is why in like Huntington's are the regions affected by that, and Parkinson's, and basically any movement disorder that you can think is probably going to be affecting the basal ganglia. And anyway, so again, just getting back on track. If you're inhibiting especially connections from the cortex to the lower regions, it seems to me what's ultimately happening is then you sort of are causing a general quiet nature of the cortex, and then which is taking away the control that the cortex is normally exhibiting on the lower regions of the brain. You know, you kind of hear it commonly called the reptilian brain, right? So this is another video I'll do, but I have this theory that, you know, basically, yeah, I don't want to get into that, but you know, I think I mentioned, you know, consciousness is all about control. That's another sort of basic prerogative of consciousness. It's allowing you to control the reflexes, essentially, is kind of how I think about it fundamentally. And reflex here, I'm using very broadly. It's not just, you know, the the reflex you think when you go to a doctor's office and you get tapped on the knee. Reflex, I'm just kind of using as anything below the cortex, and really kind of below the thalamus. And anyway, so if you're activating inhibitory neurons, or you're stimulating GABA receptors with, you know, alcohol and whatnot, then you're blocking this communication, which is allowing the lower parts of your central nervous system to sort of take control and do their thing, and thus you have a sleeping machine is kind of the idea. And it seems like the memory is going to also be affected by this, because the memory, you know, we think is this thing called the PAPAZ, P-A-P-A-Z circuit. But essentially it's this circuit that involves the hippocampus and sort of generally the midbrain and the thalamus. Well, many regions, but hippocampus, you know, sort of principally is where we believe memory is consolidated, and the basal forebrain. And so again, but these are all cortical. And so the point remains that you're sort of shutting this off, and you're not consolidating memories, and you're just, again, so you become a sleeping machine. So I say all this because, well, I mean, it might be interesting to some people, but I'm trying to get at this point that the way to not be a sleeping machine, if you haven't imbibed alcohol or, you know, whatever, it seems to be by just, there's this sort of interesting trick with consciousness, as soon as you sort of bring to light the idea that a subject has the ability to be consciousness, you can almost bring that out. And so, you know, like, yeah, I mean, so because it's this idea of reflection, is just reflecting on yourself. And so this is why, so I have this kind of funny idea, whereas like I kind of look at like Western religions with Christianity and maybe Catholicism as a very sort of central point to this, or central example, as leaning into consciousness. And they do this by building memory and bringing awareness to the actions that you did. And I think all of this is essentially, again, you're activating these cortical pathways like the hippocampus, the PAPAZ circuit. Let me just make sure. Does the PAPAZ circuit, I'm pretty sure there's a mnemonic. I just want to know for my own sake. It is, it's the hypothalamus, not the thalamus. Yeah, the forebrain, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the septum. That's the PAPAZ circuit. Okay, so anyway, but the point is, you know, this is sort of considered an important circuit for memory consolidation, and ooh, that very good. And so what I'm getting at here is that sort of activating this region is and activating it particularly with thoughts of yourself, like your past actions, as you do in a confessional, for instance, at a Catholic church, is the way to build up consciousness. And then I kind of look at sort of meditative practices as doing the opposite. They're pushing you towards a sleeping machine state. And again, I'm not putting any value judgments on these. I think, like I said, I think it's important to sort of regulate your consciousness or your awareness on both ends of this spectrum. And this is why I think meditation is very good for specifically people in Western civilization, because I think, as I've been saying, I think our religions tend to push us towards a hyper-aware insomniac fiend state through hyper projection and hyper reflection. And I think that's why people find meditation very good, because you're trying to get out of the moment, and that's the whole idea. Is you see a thought, or you don't see, whatever. Maybe you see the thought, but you close your eyes, and I think this is where the mantra also helps, because you're almost hypnotizing yourself into this rhythmic trance, and getting out of of your projections and into just a flow state of a way. That's how I think about it. And so anyway. But for somebody that resides too much in the sleeping machine state, as my argument basically is, we all did for too long, it can be very helpful to reflect on yourself and build up this self-concept, which is why I think sort of Christianity was so beneficial for Western civilization and sort of important for allowing it to reach the precipice that it did, because it basically took a population of sleeping machines. I mean, we forget, but the Europeans were the barbarians, right? 2,000 years ago, and it was the Roman Empire. I mean, Romans are technically European, but you know what I mean. The Northern Europeans were the barbarians, and then slowly Christianity became introduced, and I think its power was through this reflective capability. You went from no longer just being a segment of the tribe to having sort of an individual idea of yourself, and yeah, I think that's very powerful. But it can get away from you if you sort of don't control it, and that's what I was getting at with the feedback loops, because, as I sort of mentioned, if you're thinking about something, the act of thinking about something is programming your memory. And the way to sort of solidify that is by thinking about it over and over again. But as you do that, you make it easier to activate that specific neuronal circuit. And that's where I think sort of depressive loops come from, is basically hyperfixation on a concept, which I think fundamentally has to do with existential dread, but that's sort of another, a whole nother video. But yeah, I feel like that's probably what I wanted to say for now. So I guess the summary is sleeping machine, the pathology of it is barbarism. Barbarism being just, unregulated reptilian brain, and a lack of executive and cortical control. And we have things that push ourselves to this, such as alcohol and benzodiazepines and barbiturates, as evidenced by sort of their dampening effect on, or I guess you could say activating effect on GABA receptors, which dampen activation. And when it's not induced by drugs, I think the way to sort of get yourself out of the machine state is through reflection, as evidenced by the Catholic Church and journaling. Just all of these things that, as I've already mentioned too, like social media, just anything that you're doing to consider your past self and then banking that in your memory is getting you out of the machine state. And I think that's why you lose the your self-concept in pathologies of Alzheimer's, because you're losing your memory, and your memory is you. And yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say. So thank you to the one or two people that made it this far. Yeah, I'm going to keep putting out videos about this. God, I can't believe I said thalamus for the Papaz circuit. It's a noob mistake. Can you believe this? You believe this? Thank you for, not shutting it off right then. Hypothalamus. Much more to be said about the hypothalamus and the thalamus. Very interesting. Is the thalamus, for me, is sort of like the circuit. It's like the gateway. Well, and the hypothalamus. It's like the gateway between the lower regions of the brain and the cortex. Or I guess I should say neocortex. This is the problem with neuroanatomy too, is depending on the field that you're in, you're going to use different, slightly different phrases, or terminology is the better way to put it. And so it can get confusing. You'll see frontal cortex and prefrontal cortex. Generally, those can sometimes mean the same thing, but generally prefrontal cortex is anything anterior of the motor cortex, and then the frontal cortex would be the whole thing. But I've seen different. Anyway, okay, who cares? Okay, more about that in future videos. Signing off.